Welcome to Climate Plus, a Devex podcast. I'm Michael Igo, senior reporter at Devex. Every year, usually around this time, the world turns its attention to climate change and what we're doing, or not doing, about it. At the UN Climate Conference, or COP, negotiators get deep into the weeds on every aspect of the climate crisis. This year, it's happening in Dubai. To help make sense of this complex, critical moment, we're bringing you conversations with leading climate thinkers, activists, and experts, and asking them, can COP28 deliver? For 3 years, the Horn of Africa has faced one of the most devastating droughts in its history, pushing tens of millions into acute food insecurity, causing mass displacement, and battering the region's agricultural economy. According to some scientists, this drought was made 100 times more likely by climate change. Some of the impacts of climate change will outstrip our ability to change our lives, livelihoods, and environments to deal with them. But in other cases, like agriculture, in a world of increasing droughts or floods or both, there is a big role for human ingenuity and creativity. That is to say, climate change adaptation. This has sometimes seemed like a bit of a mysterious process to me, though. What is adaptation? How does it happen? How does it get funded? In this episode, my colleague Stephanie Beasley digs into those questions with Enock Chikava of the Gates Foundation. Here's their conversation.
This is Climate Plus. I'm Stephanie Beasley. There was a time when world leaders and climate activists mostly spoke about climate change within the framework of mitigating its impacts by taking actions such as reducing our use of fossil fuels and the flow of heat-trapping greenhouse gases. Less likely to be included in those conversations was a discussion of how to help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change that were already apparent, such as heat waves, droughts, flooding, and other extreme weather events. While this has changed somewhat in recent years, progress isn't happening fast enough. A recent UN report found an annual financing shortfall for adaptation, meaning the difference between what's spent and what needs to be spent, of an estimated $194 billion to $366 billion, even as climate impacts accelerate. Adaptation planning and implementation appear to be plateauing, the UN said. That's grim news, but some still see reason for optimism. In a recent blog post, billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates said there are more reasons to be hopeful than many people realize. Among his list of reasons is the development of new crops that will grow in warmer, drier climates, and the introduction of AI tools that could help farmers better understand climate threats. Today's guest, Enock Chikava, knows all about that work. He leads the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Agricultural Development Program and is especially focused on reducing poverty for families in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Chikava himself was raised on a smallholder farm in Zimbabwe and has more than 30 years of experience in agriculture. Enock, thanks so much for joining me. Let's start by having you just tell me a little bit more about some of this research and innovation that Bill Gates mentioned in that blog post and how it fits into the foundation's broader adaptation strategy.
No, thanks very much, Stephanie. And it's a wonderful privilege to be talking about this very important subject, even as we head towards COP28, where we all are very hopeful this time around that we are going to be turning all this rhetoric for many, many years into real action. But again, more specifically to your question, what is fundable? What will make a huge difference? So for more than 50 years now, there is a global alliance of research organizations called the CGIAR, and they have been working on crops and livestock and digital innovations. And their focus is 100% on smallholder farmers in the global south. in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia. And this is the region that now is home to 3 billion people, but they are suffering the most impact of the already consequences of climate change. Yet, I will speak here for Sub-Saharan Africa, they contributed the least in terms of the emissions, as you all know. 4% of the emissions, but they are already suffering under the consequences of climate change. You know, the Horn of Africa, 5 years back-to-back droughts. You know what has been happening in West Africa, floods on the other hand. So we believe the CGIAR has developed crop varieties. I can mention a few here, but we have one of the very climate resilient crops called cassava. And over the years, they've been developing a very solid, robust pipeline of the cassava that is able to manage or thrive even under high temperatures, drought conditions, as well as the floods. So they say it is a super crop when it comes to climate change. It has been neglected because a lot of that research, you don't find it in the private sector. But in the last few years, I'll say 15 years, there's a project called the Next Gen Cassava, which has been working with smallholder farmers, particularly women, to come up with some of the traits which the women would want to see, like the cooking properties, like early maturing, like also the supplementing some of the deficiencies in cassava, like the vitamins, micronutrients, iron. So they've been working on this pipeline of cassava. Not only that, they've been also working on other more climate smart or adaptive crops like millet, sorghum, sweet potato. And these are foods which are prevalent in most of the African regions. Very, very different. If you look at the global food system, it centralized all the food into only 4 commodities. It's about corn, it's about wheat, it's about rice and soybean. And in some places in Africa don't have the strength in producing these global food value chains. But now focusing on what is already resilient is very, very important for Africa. So the CG does that. They're also focusing on some of the chickens which are adapted to tropical conditions and then raising their productivity. When I have what we call the dual purpose poultry. So the chicken that can give you the eggs, it can give you the meat, it produces 5 times more eggs than your indigenous chicken, but very much adapted to the tropical conditions. It can scavenge for food, it can run away from predators and so on, and camouflage. So you are now taking some of these low productivity chickens, and then you improve their productivity, but keeping the adaptive capacity, as part of those traits.
Now, I wanted to ask you because I'm very curious about these chickens. Now, how do you discover if a chicken is going to be more likely to survive in like a drier, warmer environment? Like, what type of testing is this? Selective breeding, or how does this work?
It's all conventional breeding, where you already go into those communities. They have been raising chicken for many, many years. In the order of when you have, say, drought, for example, take the Horn of Africa, the first thing to suffer will be your vegetation. Your grass will die, and then that will affect your cattle because the cattle depend on the grass. And then it gets into wildlife, will be the next victim. Then it gets into some of the small ruminants like goats. And the last would be your chickens. So they're already very hardy. They can tolerate high temperatures. So you go into those communities, identify what already exists there. And then through conventional breeding, you raise the productivity so they can do more eggs, and then they can produce more meat, and then they can have a better food conversion rates. So you're getting to where the people are, take all the livestock they have, take all the crops that they already been growing for years, and then bring in new tools. You can bring in AI to make the selection more precise, increasing the accuracy of the traits. You identify where the traits are. So there are several tools which the global north has been using for many, many years. That's why they end up with superiority in the production of corn, soybean, and rice. Those tools have not been available for the global south. That is the role of the CGIAR. They are doing that, and they are now using 21st century tools and innovations, which the private sector uses in the global north. Now it is available in the public sector. That is why the CG system is best positioned to be championing all these innovations. The challenge, though, is that they are significantly underfunded. We estimate right now at about $950 million per year. They should be $2 billion. And that's why getting now to the COP, they have developed a very comprehensive investment case because for every dollar you put in the CG, you're getting $10 in economic benefits. So we are looking forward to the presentation of that investment case and to the leaders of the world, including African leaders, so that we can adequately fund the CG system, because we know its track record for the past 60 years, working in 70 countries consistently. They've been coming up with the innovations which I've been talking about: the cassava, the sorghum, the millet, and then the chickens, and then the dairy cows, the whole range of what is needed in the global south.
Climate Plus is supported by the World Bank. Back in October, World Bank President Ajay Banga called for a new vision for ending poverty on a livable planet, with a focus on climate action.
We cannot endure another period of emission-heavy growth. We must find a way to finance a different world where our climate is protected, where pandemics are manageable, if not preventable, where food is abundant and fragility and poverty are defeated. We do not suffer from a shortage of solutions. We're just paralyzed by a persistent lack of courage to pursue them. The good news is that we have solutions like these within reach and resources at our disposal to scale them.
To learn more about efforts to end poverty on a livable planet, search for the World Bank Group at COP28 or click the link in the show notes.
I'm interested. I know that you all have championed CGIAR, and I believe that you've provided grant funding to them in the past. And also last year, the Gates Foundation announced, I believe it was $1.4 billion commitment to climate adaptation over 4 years. And I imagine a fair portion of that will go to CGI's research and work as well. But I'm curious, because you talked about there's still this shortfall here. And I mentioned, overall, I think for climate adaptation, there's a shortfall in funding. How do you see, how do you sort of encourage other funders, other donors to really invest in this type of work? And of course, I mentioned, Bill Gates recently had a blog post, but it sounds like at COP in Dubai this year that's going to be something that you're going to be talking about, is how to increase investments.
So that is going to be one of our core messages there. And again, to say this is not something we are looking into solving into the future, but we need to be showcasing what are those innovations which are in need of more capital in order to scale. So that's more the farmers all across the global south can have access to it. And in fact, that this is not top of mind for the countries or high income countries in the global north. Because if you just look at the number of people who are employed in primary agricultural production, in the US, it's less than 2%. In Europe, it's less than 1%. And then you look at the contribution of agriculture to the economy. You find that again in the US, agriculture contributes 5%. Some countries in Europe, less than 3%. So it is not top of mind that we need to be funding those who are on the forefront of the actual food production. And in contrast, you go to Africa, it is more than 60% of your population is involved in primary production. So it is both where you get your food, but more importantly, it is about jobs. It is about livelihoods. This is where people get everything they need. They need school fees. You need the health care. Everything comes from what you produce, your crops and your livestock that you have on that 1 hectare. It is everything they have. And now it is under serious threat. Here's the platform that we know has been very effective in terms of reducing extreme poverty. It happened. We've had those waves, 100 years here in the US, about 90 years in Europe. Most recently, China lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty using agriculture. And this is the very sector which is affected by climate change. And that's why adaptation is very important, without neglecting, of course, mitigation to make sure that we can arrest, future emissions. But more importantly, the core message it is that today, as we speak, we have temperatures rising fastest in Africa and South Asia. And then the damage is already due to climate change is almost twice in these regions than they are when you compare with the world average. That productivity from 1961 to 2015 would have been 20% higher at global level. You take that number, because again, this is global average, they mask a lot of the realities and contexts. At global level, we have lost 20% of the productivity due to accumulated impacts of climate change. In Africa, it is 34 to 40%, and it's double. So we are losing more. So for us, it is more about climate justice. If we are serious about meeting the SDGs, it won't happen until we begin to focus on this neglected sector, which is very, very sensitive to climate. So that, I think, is going to be a key point. And then the question would be, what should we do? That is where we talk now about the CG system, this network which is present everywhere and producing exactly those innovations that can benefit people today. So in my view, I think this is a unique moment. Now that I think the leaders are becoming more serious, if you look at the Paris Agreement, the $100 billion, it didn't materialize. And then in Glasgow in 2021, we say we're going to be doubling, climate funding by 2025. We just got the numbers, some of the numbers you were talking about from UNEP. It actually went down by 21%. We are now at $19.2 billion. And by 2025, it means it must be 35. So really, very, very clear here that it's about time the world leaders become serious. And we are not just here admiring the problem from different angles, but we are going there to be showing what works, what will be the return for every dollar that you begin to invest in these proven innovations.
And do you anticipate that, world leaders will be receptive to this message? And especially when you talk about climate justice, just because, I cover philanthropy, and I know that a lot of the funding, global giving, and finance still flows mostly to the global north, from the global north to the global north, often not to organizations in the global south and efforts that are, headquartered in the global south. So I wonder, when you're talking about, going to COP and having these conversations, how do you sort of highlight the need? And for you, I imagine in many ways, this is also personal. You're from Zimbabwe. I'm sure you have family that's still there. How do you sort of talk about the needs there and the need to increase climate finance that directly, improves lives in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia?
I mean, we all know that, climate has been attracting funding, just climate in general. I think it's north of $630 billion, from about 2015 to 2021. But I think the key message here is that how much of that is flowing to those who need it the most. And we know the figures today. It is just 1.7% of that climate finance has been flowing to small scale producers. And even that, it was mainly on the mitigation. So the key message, adaptation has been neglected. We are all very much upbeat about mitigation. I'm sure there are other reasons, to that. Private sector can come in. You have a very clear metrics, on how to measure the 1.5 degrees, level is well known by everybody. But that is why we want to be clearer also on the adaptation. What is investable? So that is where we are getting in with the proven innovations and what it is done, in certain places. Last year, when we announced the $1.4 billion over 4 years, we committed to be coming back every year and explain what is working so that, again, we can bring others along in terms of understanding where do they get the best return. And this year, we're coming very, very clearly in terms of the CG system. It's a proven, and I'm sure that investment case is going to be speaking for itself more clearly. But again, to your point, this year, for the first time, the African leaders converged in Nairobi, in Kenya, for the first Africa Climate Summit. Then understanding that Africa cannot have these negotiations as bits and pieces, fragmented voices all over the place. So really to amalgamate their position, which they did. I was there. There were more than 28,000 people, a lot of people from the global north, and they heard very clearly, what the African leaders are expecting. This funding has to be accompanied by serious reforms in the multilateral organizations so that, countries don't get deeper into debt. Right now, there's a debt crisis. So if you have this climate funding for adaptation, and it means more borrowing and getting deeper into debt, that's not what leaders are expecting. So again, that climate summit is helping Africa to articulate more clearly. This is about negotiations. So I'm very hopeful that on those who need this investment the most, they are ready. And they've been preparing for many, many years, and particularly this year. And the global, leaders in the high income countries, they've been promising, and things haven't been fulfilled. I'm sure it takes, some time for you to say, okay, now maybe this is the right time for me to make good what I said in the past. So I'm hopeful that, those two will meet together and then come up with a more concrete forward plans. And of course, at the end of the day, you want to look at those plans at country level articulated well enough, and then with the African Adaptation Initiative, and they're doing exactly that, making sure that the country plans are sharper, they're very clear, the metrics are clear, so that when the funding starts to flow in, they'll be able to account for every dollar that will be made available.
So it sounds like in some ways you're not only just talking about the lack of funding, but the need to have maybe some policy changes that will to ensure, I guess, that this funding flows efficiently to the people who need it most. I wonder, you mentioned the summit you went to in Africa. What were some reforms maybe that you heard there, reform proposals that you thought maybe were interesting and that might be helpful?
We need serious reforms, even how to access, this money. At times it's very, very, very difficult. We're talking about GCF as well. It is that, can you simplify the process so that those who need the most can apply and get what they need within the shortest possible time. The other was also really to be considering the debt situation of most of the countries. You can't be asking the countries to be borrowing there was a lot of conversation around the risks. And the reason why you end up with high interest rate is because certain regions are considered risky. So it is now the profiling of that risk that has to be made good in terms of African leaders. They say, we want to come to the party. We are not just going to be here passive recipients. We also have assets. We also have forests, which are carbon sinks. And then, a lot of the source, raw materials that can be useful in the just transition, they sit right in Africa. So getting to the table with, this is what we have, these are our needs, but you can't draw us into further debt. So I think that was really, really, emphasized. And I think it is a good point. Because again, I think one of the arguments is that, Africa, when they borrow, it's about 5 to 7 times more expensive, for the same source of money. So really, those are, very much justified issues to be put on the table. And I think this will continue even as the negotiations will be in the COP28.
Are you looking for the inside story on what's happening at organisations like the World Bank, USAID or the Gates Foundation? Then you need to be reading Devex Pro. I'm Jessica Abrahams and I'm the editor of Devex Pro. Pro is Devex's premium news subscription, where our expert reporters and analysts take you beyond the headlines, deep into the trends and institutions shaping the $200 billion aid industry. As well as all our news, you'll get access to conversations with global development leaders, resources to help you grow in your career, and a subscriber-only newsletter full of insider news and tidbits. See for yourself by getting a free trial today at devex.com/pro.
So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and return back to some of the innovations that Bill Gates had mentioned, and particularly I was interested in AI and how AI is part of this adaptation strategy. I know that the Gates Foundation has been making investments in the development of AI solutions in Africa. And, of course, technology is another one of those areas where often the global South is kind of left behind or left out of the development. So can you sort of talk about the importance of developing AI solutions that benefit the global South, and how, you see AI being used for climate adaptation work?
So I mean, there are several applications for artificial intelligence. I think one, it is in how you do the selection of traits. Normally, I mean, there are things which will take very long if you are doing that, counting things, using people, and then the machine will be able to really look into the various array of traits, that we have, and then begin to match that with some of the needs of the consumers, of the producers, and of the processors. So the ability to match what your crops can provide. I can give you one example here of the beans. There are several things you can look at within the bean value chain. And at times it is very cumbersome. Doing that, you need to lots of people and then people will be actually doing the counting and then looking at each bean, and then you look at the characteristics, you select, and then go to the next cycle. So all that work can be made simpler, via artificial intelligence. So I'd say that is part of, as you develop new innovations, you can be more precise, you can increase the accuracy, and you can begin to match the needs of the consumers, particularly women here. You look at some of the cooking properties, the time it takes to be preparing. All those, you need some help. And then I think AI will do, a lot of work. So we have some work there, which we are doing with Google and the Alphabet, and then working together with the SEAT Biodiversity, which is part of the CG system. And we've got some work in Tanzania and in Kenya. and they are working on more than 5 crops, which include millet, PGNP, some of the sweet potato, and then sorghum. So really those local crops, understanding them better, characterizing them, identifying what are the core traits, and then matching them with the needs of the consumers and processors as well as producers. And then also on the front end, you can also come up with some of the voice technologies. I mean, since I came here from Africa to the US, I can use Alexa. I use, but at times my accent might not be compatible with Alexa. I have to change my I have to I have to change my accent in order for Alexa to understand me. So we are also doing a lot of voice and language harvesting to make sure that people can speak in their own local languages using their own local accents, and then they can be getting the help they need in real time. So there's several applications, front end, back end, to make your innovation development more precise, faster, accurate, but also to be using that as a channel of relaying new information to the customers, particularly the smallholder farmers, where your literacy levels is very, very low. So we need to be able to capture what are their exact needs. So again, AI can be applied in those areas.
I can only imagine how you're changing your accent. I don't think I've ever. I mean, I don't know what voice you're using, but I mean, I think that's a really good point. A lot of technology, because it is developed in northern countries, are particular to those environments and not always inclusive. And sort of along those lines, I know that a big focus for the Gates Foundation is pushing forward women's economic empowerment and gender parity. And you mentioned that, a lot of smallholder farmers are women. So in many ways, by working to help them adapt to climate change and giving them access to tools and technology like AI, it seems like a big part of the work you're doing is helping to lift not only families, but women in particular out of poverty in some of the places you're working. I wonder if you can kind of talk about that experience.
Yes, women, they consider about 60% of the people who work on the farm. So if you are a company that distributes seeds like what I did, for more than 25 years, you do your field day and you find that 90% of the people who attend the field day are women. When it comes to the purchase time in terms of what inputs do you buy on the farm, you find that often maybe it is the husband that works somewhere, and then they say, okay, it's now time for me to buy the inputs for you. And then they just buy the inputs without even consulting the women. So we need to be intentional about making sure that our distribution system is sensitive or in service of women. We also looked at that time looking at the pack sizes. Smallholder farmers, in particular women, they don't get all their money in one day when they're preparing for the season. We've realized that, if you are selling, say, maize seed, you can't be expecting all your customers to be buying a 10 kg, although you need a 10 kg to do 1 acre. But particularly women, they will buy 2 kg at a time as and when they get that $1 or 50 cents. So they will have several 2 kgs to add up to the 10 kg which they need, per hectare or per acre. So all those are being very intentional about the needs of the women. We know today that the productivity gap in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, and Kenya between female-headed households or farms and male-headed is about 25 to 30%, because women have other unique needs and they won't be able to access credit at the same levels. They don't have collateral like men do. So it is now part of our work. We are now calling it more women power. You can't just talk about empowerment without the active involvement of those women. They should be involved in the decision making. They should be involved in the policy formulation. So their presence, and then making sure, as you focus on the partners, do you have partners which have women as leaders? Because that matters. The way they will run the organization, like the SMEs, small and medium enterprises. We have some work with the AGRA, and they have a platform they call Value for Her. And then they are reaching out to all the SMEs which are led by women and making sure that they lend money to them because they've got unique needs. So we do a lot of those from a policy perspective, but also going very deep into demonstrating also what would be unique. We have realized that for climate adaptation and resilience building, the more female farmers or women farmers can diversify, the more enterprise they have on that farm, the more they're able to be building resilient. They need to be doing crops. They need to be doing livestock at the same time. They need to be doing trees, and they need to be doing many other things, not just specializing in one particular value chain, but there's a high risk. If the price collapse of one particular, then it means they are right on the edge. So we have several things that we work on demonstrating what gender transformative interventions look like. You can be gender intentional, like when you do all your research and development. You can be choosing certain crops which women are already leading, like cassava, like your legumes, and then maybe they're lagging behind in terms of the research and development. That's also part of the CG. We focus on that. But also when it comes to the actual market access, there is some unique requirements for women. And we have a team here that does that every day. One, focusing into the integration. All our work, all the innovations, we must have women voices in shaping those innovations. But also on the delivery part, there will be certain channels which will be more effective in reaching women. So we have quite a huge program here. And women's empowerment is one of the 4 strategic goals that we have within the agricultural development program. We have productivity of land and labor, which applies to men and women. We talk about the income at household level for both men and women. Then we've got the nutrition all year round for both men and women. But the 4th one is about the women's empowerment. And we have some metrics around that. There's what we call the WEAR index, just to make sure that the women have agency, they have control, they have a voice in how they use the resources and the proceeds, coming out of farming.
What's next, do you think, for the foundation in terms of its climate adaptation work? And how do you think, this year's COP might help set the agenda for the foundation going forward into 2024? What kind of outcomes, I guess, are you sort of hoping to see? And how do you think that might be incorporated into the work you're doing?
So I would say 2 big things. One, I think the world has to realize and understand that there is a climate injustice, particularly for those who have contributed the least. They are suffering first, and they're suffering most. I think this is a very, very important point for the world to know, that we won't be able to meet our SDG goals on poverty, hunger, malnutrition, gender equality until we focus intently on smallholder farmers. That, I think, is a very core message, and we continue to do that. The second, it is about how do we do that? For us, it is going to be how we adequately fund the CG system, for the reasons that I have talked about, and for the reasons the investment case to articulate even more accurately, even as we get to COP. I think there's going to be a session when the world leaders and then the CG system officially launching the investment case. Very, very important, not just for the global north and high income countries, but also even for the African leaders. Because the CG system produces public global goods accessible to anyone. But how those public global goods become national goods depends on the investment at country level. What is that capacity that you need, for the African leaders to build within their own country so that they can now begin to access? You need to be testing those in your own country. You need to make sure that you develop functional delivery systems. You need the enabling policies for private sector to come in and be part of that distribution network. So there is that leadership role by those who need the investments, their minimum investment. They need to prioritize what are those value chains that will give them the best return within the country. And then maybe the last thing, it is for us to focus on what already works today. There's that list of many, many innovations that we have. And then we need capital to be flowing towards those. And maybe, as we started last year at COP27, can we, for the next COP, just come back and be reporting on what's working, what's not working, and then fine tune as we go. Otherwise, these forums will become negotiations and announcements, and we don't get to know, what those pledges have amounted to.
Well, Enock Chikava, thanks so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about this, and I hope you have an excellent COP experience this year.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for listening to Climate Plus. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, and you can also leave us a rating or a review. We'll be publishing episodes twice a week in the lead up to, during, and after COP28. So make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast streaming platform. If you want to share some feedback on this episode or have questions you'd like answered, we'd love to hear from you. Drop me a message on X, formerly Twitter, @alterigo, or send an email to podcast@devex.com. Climate Plus is a podcast from Devex. Today's episode was produced by Lauren Evans and edited by Thomas Cherep. The series editor is Catherine Cheney. It's hosted by me, Michael Ago.